apartment 7A story.
Open your mind. Open your mind.
You know, I've always had a feeling about that place, Mark said, his eyes fixed on the dilapidated apartment complex. Oh, come on. It's just an old building, Laura scoffed, nudging him playfully. Besides, the rent's too good to pass up. The two friends had just moved into apartment 7A, a space that seemed to carry an air of quiet mystery. Despite its worn exterior, the inside was surprisingly clean, if not a tad outdated. Laura's skepticism was palpable, but Mark couldn't shake the chill that danced down his spine every time they approached their new home. The first few days were uneventful. They painted the walls a cheerful yellow, filled the kitchen with the smell of burnt dinners, and laughed over card games that stretched into the night. Laura threw herself into her new job with enthusiasm, while Mark worked tirelessly on his novel, inspired by the change of scenery. Yet, as the weeks wore on, strange sounds began to echo through the paper. Thin walls at odd hours. It was nothing dramatic at first, just the occasional creak or distant murmur. But the whispers grew louder. Mark and Laura move into apartment 7A, a seemingly clean and affordable place despite its eerie exterior. Initially enjoying their new life, they noticed strange, increasingly loud whispers through the walls after a few weeks, which Mark finds disturbing despite Laura's skepticism. One night, Mark sat at his desk, typing away under the flickering glow of his desk lamp, when the silence was shattered by an eerie chant, faint yet unmistakable. He paused, his heart thudding in his chest, and listened intently. Laura was out with colleagues, so he was alone with his thoughts and the unsettling melody. It was like a lullaby sung by a dozen ghosts, the words indistinct and mournful. He told himself it was just the wind playing tricks on his overactive imagination, but the hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and the goosebumps on his arms didn't lie. The next evening, Laura returned home later than usual, her cheeks flushed from a successful work function. She didn't notice the chill in the apartment, or the way Mark's eyes darted towards the walls every few minutes. When she finally did hear the whispers, she dismissed them as a neighbor's TV turned up too loud. Mark knew better. He suggested they speak to the landlord, Mr. Jenkins, a man who looked as if he had more secrets than the walls themselves. Laura agreed, but something in her voice told Mark she was just humoring him. At night, Mark hears a disturbing chant in the apartment, which Laura dismisses when she returns home. Despite her skepticism, the unsettling whispers persist, and Mark becomes more convinced of their supernatural nature. They decide to talk to Mr. Jenkins, their secretive landlord. Mr. Jenkins was less than helpful. He brushed off their concerns with a forced chuckle, claiming that old buildings often made strange noises. His eyes, however, held a flicker of something Mark couldn't quite place. Was it fear, or was he hiding something? The conversation left him feeling more uneasy than before, the whispers seeming to grow louder in his mind. That night, Laura heard them too. The whispers grew into a cacophony that neither of them could ignore. They'd wake in the dead of night, their sheets twisted around them, the sound of the spectral choir echoing through the apartment. Laura's skepticism began to wane, and Mark could see the fear burgeoning in her eyes. They decided to investigate, tiptoeing through the corridors, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The whispers grew stronger as they approached the stairwell that led to the upper floors. Mark and Laura confront Mr. Jenkins about the whispers, but he's unhelpful. Laura also begins to hear them, and their fear intensifies. They decide to investigate and find the whispers grow louder near the stairwell to the upper floors of the apartment complex. Their hearts racing, they ascended the stairs, each step echoing like a gunshot in the deserted building. On the 5th floor, the air grew colder, the whispers clearer. They stopped outside apartment 7A, their breaths shallow. The door was slightly ajar, beckoning them with a soft, sinister whisper of its own. Laura reached for the handle, but Mark held her back, his instincts screaming at him not to go in. But it was too late. The door creaked open, revealing a darkness that seemed to reach out and swallow them whole. With a trembling hand, Mark pushed the door wide, and together they stepped into the abyss of their haunted home. Inside, the apartment looked the same as they'd left it, yet everything felt off-kilter. The shadows danced in a way that suggested hidden forms, and the whispers grew to a fever pitch, swirling around them like a malevolent tornado. Laura clutched Mark's arm, her eyes wide with terror. They moved cautiously through the living room, the kitchen, and down the hall to the bedroom. The bed was unmade, the closet door opened just enough to cast a narrow strip of light across the floor. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of anguished voices that seemed to come from every corner of the room. Laura's hand tightened around his bicep, her nails digging in. Mark and Laura investigate the whispers, leading them to apartment 7A. The apartment is cold and eerie, with whispers growing stronger. They find their own untouched living space inside, with the whispers centering around the bedroom. Laura's fear becomes palpable, her grip tight on Mark's arm. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the breath from their lungs. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. Then, from the closet, a figure emerged. It was a young girl, no more than 8, with long matted hair and eyes that were blacker than the darkest night. She was dressed in a tattered white nightgown, and she looked as lost as they felt. Laura took a tentative step forward, but Mark's grip on her arm tightened, warning her to stay back. The girl didn't seem to notice them at first, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond them. "Hello," Laura whispered, her voice cracking. The girl's head snapped up, and she stared directly at them, her eyes boring into their souls. Then, in a voice that was not her own, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come here. Now, you'll never leave." With that, the whispers returned, louder and more furious than ever. The room grew cold, so cold that their breath froze in the air. Laura's eyes filled with tears as she stumbled backward, her legs giving out beneath her. Mark caught her, his mind racing. This was no figment of their imaginations, no trick of the light. They were in the presence of something ancient and angry, something that had been disturbed, and now it had its sights set on them. The whispers stop when a young girl appears in the closet of apartment 7A. She warns Laura and Mark that they shouldn't have come and that they won't be able to leave. The room turns freezing cold, confirming the supernatural presence and their entrapment in the haunted apartment. Mark and Laura move into a peculiar apartment with strange whispers that Mark hears, which Laura initially dismisses, after discussing with their unhelpful landlord. They investigate and find an eerie, cold, untouched replica of their own living space in apartment 7A. A ghostly girl appears, revealing the apartment's supernatural nature and their entrapment. They had to get out. They had to get help. But as they turned to flee, the door slammed shut, the lock clicking into place with a finality that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. The girl took a step closer, her expression twisting into something monstrous, and the whispers grew louder, urging them to do something terrible. Mark knew they were in way over their heads, that the secrets of apartment 7A were darker than he could ever have imagined. And as the whispers grew to a crescendo, he realized with a cold, sinking dread that they might never escape the clutches of whatever haunted this forsaken place. They stumbled through the apartment, trying every door and window, but they were all sealed shut. The whispers grew closer, the cold pressing against their skin like icy claws. Laura sobbed quietly, clutching at Mark's arm, her eyes wide with horror. The girl followed them, her steps unnaturally silent, her eyes never leaving theirs. Mark felt a strange compulsion to listen, to understand the whispers, but he fought it with every ounce of his being. He knew that to give in would mean the end of their sanity, if not their lives. The door to apartment 7A locks them in, and the supernatural presence intensifies. Laura and Mark are trapped with the ghostly girl as the whispers urge them to do something terrible. The apartment's exits are all sealed, and the girl's gaze holds them hostage as the cold tightens around them, testing their resolve to resist the whispers. In the living room, the TV flickered to life, displaying a fuzzy image of a news report from decades past. It showed the apartment complex, surrounded by police tape, the same stairwell they had just climbed. The reporter spoke of a grisly murder-suicide that had taken place in apartment 7A, a family torn apart by unspeakable evil. The girl on the screen looked just like the one standing before them now. The realization hit Mark like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a ghostly presence. It was something far more powerful, something that had latched onto their very souls. The whispers grew louder, the pressure in the room increasing until it was almost unbearable. Laura's breath came in ragged gasps, her eyes glazed over. Mark knew he had to act fast. He grabbed a candlestick from the mantel and smashed the TV screen. The image fizzling into static. The whispers recoiled, and the cold retreated slightly. It was a small victory, but it gave him hope. They needed a way to cleanse the apartment, to banish whatever was trapping them here. And as the girl's form grew more solid, her eyes glowing with an unearthly light, Mark knew they had to find it quickly, before it was too late. The TV in apartment 7A reveals a historical news report of a murder-suicide in the same unit. The girl in the vision matches the ghostly child in the room, suggesting a connection. Mark's desperate action of smashing the TV disrupts the whispers, revealing the presence is more than just a typical haunting. They need to find a way to purify the apartment before the malevolent spirit takes over Laura completely. They retreated into the kitchen, searching desperately for anything that could help. Laura's trembling hand found a bottle of holy water she brought from her grandmother's house, a relic from her Catholic upbringing. They didn't know if it would work, but it was all they had. Mark took the bottle and approached the girl, the whispers now a deafening roar. He held the holy water out to her, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Leave us," he said firmly. "You don't belong here anymore." The girl's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Mark saw the flicker of a smile. Then she lunged at him, her cold, skeletal hands reaching out to snatch the bottle away. Laura screamed, and Mark threw the holy water, dousing the girl in a shower of sacred liquid. She screamed, a sound that seemed to rip the fabric of reality itself. The whispers grew to a shriek, and the room began to shake violently. Plates crashed to the floor, the lights flickered, and the air grew colder still. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. Laura finds holy water in the kitchen, which they hope might help. Mark confronts the ghostly girl, demanding she leave. When she lunges for the holy water, Mark throws it at her, causing a dramatic reaction. The room erupts in chaos with the girl screaming and the apartment shaking. After a climactic moment, everything abruptly stops. Laura and Mark are trapped in apartment 7A with a malevolent spirit. They discover a disturbing history of the apartment through a TV news report and attempt to fight back using holy water, resulting in a confrontation that shakes the apartment and temporarily silences the whispers. The girl was gone. The whispers had ceased. The apartment was still, the silence a stark contrast to the chaos that had just engulfed them. Laura collapsed to the floor, her breath coming in great, heaving sobs. Mark pulled her into his arms, his own body shaking with relief and fear. They had survived the first night, but he knew the battle was far from over. Apartment 7A had a history of tragedy, and it was clear that they hadn't seen the last of its horrors. The girl's warning echoed in his mind. "You shouldn't have come here. Now, you'll never leave." Mark vowed that they would find a way out, that they would not become the next tragic chapter in the apartment's dark story. But as they sat there in the ruins of their living room, surrounded by the whispers of the past, the future looked bleak and uncertain. They decided to seek professional help, but the local paranormal investigators were skeptical at best, dismissive at worst. Desperation grew with each passing day. Laura's job performance suffered, and Mark's writing stalled, the creeping dread seeping into his every thought. They tried to ignore the whispers, the cold spots, and the eerie sense of being watched. But it was like trying to ignore a storm raging outside their windows. They knew they couldn't live like this forever. After the intense encounter, the girl vanishes, leaving the apartment eerily quiet. Laura and Mark consider themselves lucky to have survived. They attempt to find professional help, but meet skepticism and disbelief. The haunting's effects bleed into their daily lives, causing stress and anxiety. Mark is particularly affected, unable to focus on his writing. Their situation seems hopeless as they're trapped in the apartment, with no clear escape from the haunting. One evening, as Laura was searching the internet for answers, she stumbled upon an article about a priest known for his success in exorcisms. It was a long shot, but they were out of options. They reached out to Father O'Sullivan, whose calm yet firm demeanor offered a glimmer of hope. He agreed to come to the apartment and perform a blessing, advising them to gather any religious artifacts they had to bolster their protection. Laura's grandmother had been right to give her the holy water. Maybe her faith would be their salvation. The night of the blessing arrived. Laura had filled every corner of the apartment with candles, their flickering light casting an eerie glow on the walls. Mark could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. Father O'Sullivan arrived, a gentle-looking man with a steely resolve in his eyes. He began the ritual, his voice steady and strong. The whispers grew quieter as he moved through the rooms, sprinkling holy water and reciting ancient prayers. Laura clutched her rosary, her knuckles white, while Mark held onto her tightly, trying to be the rock she needed. Laura finds hope in an article about Father O'Sullivan, a priest with a history of successful exorcisms. They contact him, and he agrees to perform a blessing. In preparation, Laura fills the apartment with religious artifacts and candles, hoping to purify the space. The tension is palpable as they await his arrival, desperate for relief from the haunting. As the priest approached the bedroom, the whispers grew bolder again. The girl's room, the room where the finality of the murder-suicide had taken place. Mark felt his heart hammer in his chest as the priest paused at the doorway, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond. Laura whispered a prayer under her breath, and Mark added his own silent plea for deliverance. With a deep breath, Father O'Sullivan stepped inside, his voice rising in a challenge to whatever malevolent force lurked within. The room erupted in chaos. The whispers grew to a howling fury, the air thickening with the scent of burning candle wax. The girl reappeared, her eyes ablaze with anger. Laura screamed, and Mark felt his grip on reality slipping away. Yet Father O'Sullivan stood firm, his voice a beacon of light in the swirling shadows. The girl's form flickered and writhed as he recited the rites of exorcism. Laura's prayers grew louder, her voice joining his in a desperate plea for mercy. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the room fell silent. The girl vanished, and the cold retreated like a retreating tide. The priest looked exhausted, but there was a sense of peace that had not been present before. The exorcism begins in the girl's room, the epicenter of the haunting. The room fills with chaos, the girl's anger palpable. Laura and Mark are overwhelmed by fear, but Father O'Sullivan remains steadfast, reciting exorcism rites. The girl's spirit fades away with a sudden silence, and a newfound peace fills the apartment, hinting at the effectiveness of their efforts. Laura and Mark face the haunting's impact on their daily lives, seeking help from various sources. They learn of a priest, Father O'Sullivan, known for exorcisms, and manage to convince him to perform a blessing. Laura prepares the apartment while Mark's anxiety grows, and the exorcism commences, bringing chaos and fear before culminating in a brief peace as the girl's spirit appears to dissipate. They had won this battle, but Mark knew the war was not over. The whispers might be silenced for now, but the memory of the girl's malicious smile lingered. He looked at Laura, her face a mix of relief and terror, and made a promise to her and to themselves. they would not rest until the apartment was free of the evil that dwelled within. They had disturbed something ancient and angry, and now they had to find a way to live with it, or find a way to destroy it. Either way, the story of Apartment 7A was far from over. Following Father O'Sullivan's instructions, they kept the apartment as sacred a space as possible, filling it with more religious artifacts and maintaining a constant vigil of prayer. Laura's work improved slightly, though the fear never truly left her eyes. Mark, on the other hand, found himself drawn to the darkness, his writing taking a macabre turn that reflected their new reality. The whispers remained at bay, but the tension remained, coiled like a serpent waiting to strike again. Laura and Mark are left with an uneasy peace following the exorcism attempt. They continue to fortify their home with religious items and maintain vigilant prayers, though fear lingers. Laura's work improves slightly, but Mark's writing becomes increasingly dark, reflecting their haunted reality. The whispers are absent, but the malevolent presence isn't entirely gone. One night, as Laura slept fitfully beside him, Mark heard something different. It was a soft, almost comforting melody, the antithesis of the whispers they'd grown to dread. He sat up in bed, listening intently, his heart racing. The music grew louder, and he felt compelled to follow it, to find its source. He crept through the apartment, the song guiding him like a siren's call. It grew stronger as he approached the girl's room, the door now closed and seemingly untouched since the exorcism. With trembling hands, Mark pushed the door open. The room was bathed in a soft, ethereal glow that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the music. The air was no longer cold and heavy, but filled with a gentle warmth that soothed his fears. In the center of the room, the girl from before stood, but she was changed. Her eyes were no longer black voids but pools of sadness, and her tattered nightgown had transformed into a shimmering white dress. The whispers had been replaced by a hauntingly beautiful lullaby that filled the air. Mark took a tentative step forward, unsure if he was dreaming or if he had stumbled into another nightmare. The girl looked up and saw him, her lips curving into a sad smile. "You came," she whispered, her voice now sweet and melodious. "What do you want?" Mark asked, his voice thick with emotion. "To tell you my story," she said, her eyes brimming with unused tears. "To explain why I'm still here." Mark hears a comforting melody in the apartment, leading him to the girl's room. The room is warm and glowing, and the girl appears in a white dress, her eyes filled with sadness. The whispers are replaced by a haunting lullaby. She beckons him, hinting she has a story to tell, suggesting she may need help to move on rather than be defeated. The girl began to sing, her voice pure and clear. And as she did, images flickered around her, scenes from a life filled with pain and sorrow. Laura stirred in bed, drawn by the sound, and joined Mark in the doorway, her eyes wide with wonder. The girl's song spoke of love lost, of a family torn apart by forces beyond their control, and of a soul trapped in a cycle of anger and despair. As the last notes faded away, she looked at them with a pleading gaze. "Can you help me?" she asked. "Can you find a way to set me free?" Laura took a step forward, her fear forgotten. "We'll try," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We'll do whatever it takes." The girl's smile was genuine this time, filled with a warmth that seemed to warm the very core of their beings. "Thank you," she said, and then she was gone, leaving only the echo of her lullaby and the gentle glow of the candles behind. The following days were a blur of research and late-night discussions with Father O'Sullivan, who had become a trusted ally in their quest to free the girl's spirit. They pored over ancient texts and spoke with others who had encountered similar hauntings. Laura's work took a backseat as she devoted herself to helping the girl, her empathy driving her to uncover the truth. Mark's writing took a backseat as well, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. The girl shares her tragic story through a lullaby, revealing her pain and desire for freedom. Laura and Mark, moved by her plight, pledged to help. They enlist Father O'Sullivan's help and immerse themselves in research to understand the spirit's predicament, setting aside their personal lives and concerns to aid her. They discovered that the girl, whose name was Emily, had been caught in a battle between dark forces and a desperate attempt by her mother to save her soul. The exorcism had only temporarily subdued the malevolent spirits that had claimed the apartment, and now they needed to perform a more powerful ritual to release her and bring peace to the tortured souls that remained. The night of the ritual arrived, and the apartment hummed with an energy that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Laura and Mark had gathered everything they needed: sacred herbs, crystals, and a set of ancient prayers that had been passed down through generations. They had invited a small group of friends, those they trusted implicitly, to act as witnesses and protectors. The air was thick with anticipation as they began the intricate ceremony, their voices weaving together in a tapestry of hope and determination. The whispers grew louder as they worked, a cacophony of anger and despair, yet they remained steadfast, their hearts beating in time with the incantations. A sudden gust of wind rushed through the room, extinguishing candles and sending papers flying. Laura clung to Mark, her eyes never leaving the spot where Emily's spirit was anchored. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. The whispers ceased, the wind died down, and the room was once again bathed in a peaceful silence. Laura looked at Mark, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and whispered, "We did it." Laura and Mark learned Emily's history from their research and decide to perform a powerful ritual to free her spirit, with the support of their trusted friends and guidance from Father O'Sullivan. They conduct the ceremony. Despite the escalating malevolence in the apartment, they remain steadfast, and the ritual appears to succeed, bringing an end to the whispers and restoring peace. Laura and Mark feel a sense of accomplishment and relief. The door to the girls' room slowly opened, and a soft light spilled out, casting a path to the balcony. They watched as Emily's spirit emerged, looking around the room with wonder. She looked at Laura and Mark, her eyes clear and free of the torment that had once consumed her. Then, with a final smile, she stepped into the light and disappeared. The silence that followed was profound, a stark contrast to the tumult that had filled the room mere moments before. Laura and Mark looked at each other, their hearts pounding in their chests, the weight of what they had just witnessed sinking in. The apartment felt different now, lighter, as if a dark cloud had been lifted. They shared a look of disbelief and hope, their eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. Their friends, who had been watching the ritual with a mix of skepticism and fear, began to murmur among themselves, the tension in the air dissipating. Mark stepped forward, tentatively reaching out to touch the spot where Emily had stood. But there was nothing there. Laura took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. They had done it. They had given Emily the peace she so desperately sought. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences ceased. The whispers that had haunted their nights were gone, and the apartment felt like a true home for the first time since they'd moved in. Laura's job performance improved, and Mark's writing took on a new depth, inspired by the harrowing experience they'd shared. They spoke to Mr. Jenkins, who was visibly relieved to hear that the disturbances had stopped. He revealed that the apartment had a long history of strange happenings, and that many tenants had moved out over the years, unable to cope with the eerie presence. Their lives began to return to normal, or as normal as they could be after such an ordeal. Yet there remained an unspoken understanding between Laura and Mark, a bond forged in the crucible of fear and hope. They had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger for it. They often found themselves sitting on the balcony where Emily's spirit had taken its leave, watching the world go by in quiet contemplation. They knew that they had made a difference, that they had changed the course of a trapped soul's existence. But the story of Apartment 7A wasn't quite finished. As they settled into their newfound peace, they couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the building's history, more to uncover. They had dealt with the immediate threat, but there were whispers of other spirits, other tragedies hidden within its walls. Mark found himself drawn to the stories of the other residents, and Laura's curiosity about the apartment's past grew into a quiet obsession. They realized that while they had helped one lost soul, there might be others who needed their help. And so their lives took an unexpected turn. Laura and Mark became the custodians of Apartment 7A's secrets, piecing together the tapestry of pain and loss that had been woven into its very foundation. They were determined to unravel the threads of darkness and replace them with ones of healing and light. The apartment complex was more than just a place to live. It had become their mission, their purpose. As they worked to heal the other spirits trapped within, they discovered that in doing so, they were also healing themselves, finding strength in the most unlikely of places. And as the whispers of the past grew fainter, they knew that they had found their true home, a place where they could face their fears and conquer them together. The first few months were a whirlwind of research and rituals, each one more intense than the last. They found themselves drawn into the lives of the building's former inhabitants, uncovering stories of heartache and sorrow that had been buried for decades. The whispers grew less frequent, and the chilling presence that had once haunted them began to dissipate. Yet they were acutely aware that their work was far from over. There was something deeper, something more powerful, lurking beneath the surface. It was as if the very structure of the building was a prison for lost souls, a purgatory that only they had the key to unlock. Their friends and colleagues talked about their newfound obsession in hushed tones, unsure what to make of the couple's nocturnal activities. Laura and Mark didn't care about the whispers of gossip that followed them. They had a higher calling. They knew that every spirit they helped to find peace was one less trapped in the endless cycle of pain and despair. They had become the guardians of Apartment 7A, and they took their role seriously. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the stars, Laura spoke up, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. "We can't stop now," she said, her eyes shining with determination. "We've come too far, and there are still others who need us." Mark nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of her words. "We'll do it," he promised. "We'll free them all." Their journey had only just begun, and with each step they took, the whispers grew softer, the shadows less daunting. Yet the question remained, what was the source of this malevolent energy that had claimed so many souls? And could they truly put an end to it? Or were they merely delaying the inevitable? The whispers grew faint, and the cold spots in the apartment began to warm. Laura's work flourished, and Mark's writing took a turn for the better, as if the ghosts of Apartment 7A had become his muse. They continued to perform the rituals, each one more powerful than the last, each one bringing peace to another lost soul. They grew more adept at navigating the spiritual realm, their bond growing stronger as they face each challenge together. Yet the ultimate test lay ahead, one that would force them to confront the darkest corner of the building's history and the evil that had taken root there. The night was heavy with anticipation when they stumbled upon the final piece of the puzzle, an old journal hidden in the bowels of the complex. It told the story of the original owner, a man whose greed had opened a door to malevolent spirits. The journal contained the dark incantations that had summoned the evil, and it was clear that to banish it, they would have to perform a ritual of their own. The final showdown was intense. Laura and Mark stood hand in hand, their eyes closed tightly as they recited the ancient words that would seal the doorway to the spirit world. The air grew thick with power, and the whispers grew to a deafening roar. The walls trembled, and the floor felt as if it would give way beneath them, but they didn't waver. Their love for each other, their commitment to the lost souls of Apartment 7A, was stronger than any fear that the darkness could throw at them. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The whispers died away, the cold retreated, and the apartment was bathed in a warm golden light. They opened their eyes to find themselves standing in the empty hallway. The journal closed before them. The air was clean, the shadows had lifted. They had done it. They had banished the malevolent force that had plagued the building for so long. Their friends gathered around them, their faces a mix of awe and relief. Laura and Mark shared a knowing smile, the weight of their responsibility lifting from their shoulders. The apartment complex was finally at peace, and with it, their hearts. But as they stood there, hand in hand, they both knew that their story with apartment 7A was far from over. The whispers had led them to this moment. But there were always more secrets waiting to be uncovered, more souls yearning for release. They had become the guardians of the lost, and they would continue to fight for them. For as long as the building stood, the following months were a mix of quiet nights and sudden, jolting moments of activity. They learned to live with the echoes of the past, the faint whispers that remained. Knowing that the true battle was won, Laura's work blossomed, her empathy a beacon to those who sensed the unexplained. Mark's writing took a darker turn, his words now imbued with a supernatural insight that had earned him a devoted following. One night, as Laura was returning from a particularly harrowing exorcism, she found Mark sitting at his desk, his eyes glazed over. A look of horror etched on his face. He had discovered something that had been hidden from them all along. "We have to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "We can't stay here any longer." "What is it?" Laura asked, her heart racing. Mark held up a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. It spoke of a hidden chamber, a room that had been sealed off since the building's construction, a place where the original owner had conducted his darkest rituals. "We've been fighting the symptoms," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we've never addressed the disease at its core." Together, they approached the spot where the chamber was said to be hidden. The walls seemed to pulse with malice, the very air thick with dread. Laura lit a candle, its flame flickering bravely in the face of the shadows. With trembling hands, Mark uncovered the hidden entrance, a door that had been bricked over long ago. Behind it, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of anger and despair. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the inky blackness. The chamber was small and claustrophobic, the stench of decay heavy in the air. In the center stood an altar, stained with the remnants of long-forgotten sacrifices. Laura gagged, her hand flying to her mouth, but Mark's grip on her arm was unyielding. They had come too far to turn back now. On the altar lay an object that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, drawing them closer even as their instincts screamed for them to run. It was a talisman, a focus for the dark power that had infested the building. Laura reached out, her hand hovering over the object, and felt a coldness that seemed to seep into her very soul. "We can't destroy it," Mark said, his voice strained, "but we can contain it." They worked quickly, their movements precise and practiced. They had come prepared, knowing that this was the final piece of the puzzle. As Laura wrapped the talisman in a blessed cloth, Mark recited an incantation, the words foreign and powerful on his tongue. The chamber trembled, and the whispers grew to a fever pitch. But they didn't stop. With a final cry of effort, Laura sealed the talisman within a silver box, and the whispers ceased. The air grew still, the malicious energy dissipating like mist in the morning sun. They looked at each other, their eyes reflecting a mix of triumph and dread. They had done it. They had found the source of the darkness. But what awaited them now, as the guardians of this tainted place, was a responsibility greater than they could have ever imagined. The whispers had led them to the heart of the evil, and now they had to decide if they could live with the burden of containing it. They had become the caretakers of a secret that could never be shared, a truth that bound them to apartment 7A forever. The whispers had stopped for now, but the memory of the girl's words lingered. "You'll never leave." Was it a warning or a prophecy? Laura and Mark weren't sure, but they knew that their lives had irrevocably changed. They returned to their apartment, the silver box containing the talisman clutched tightly in Laura's hand. The once haunted space felt eerily calm, as if it had been cleansed of its malevolent guests. They placed the box in a hidden corner of their room, wrapping it in chains and sealing it with blessed tape. It was a temporary solution, but one that bought them time to plan their next move. The days turned into weeks, and the whispers remained at bay. Lior's career took a leap, and Mark's writing gained a new depth, his stories now infused with a supernatural edge that resonated with his readers. Yet, the peace was a fragile one. They could feel the talisman's presence, a constant reminder of the power they held within their grasp. It whispered to them at night, promising them secrets and power beyond their wildest dreams, but they resisted its siren call. One evening, as they sat in their living room, the whispers returned, softer this time, a gentle coaxing that seemed to emanate from the box itself. Lior looked at Mark, her eyes wide with terror. The whispers grew louder, the room growing colder. It was clear the box was not enough. They needed to find a more permanent solution, one that would protect them and their fellow tenants from the talisman's influence. They sought out the priest who had initially blessed their apartment, Father O'Sullivan. He listened to their story with a grave expression, nodding solemnly when they showed him the newspaper clipping and explained their findings. "This is no ordinary haunting," he said, his voice filled with awe and fear. "The power you've encountered is ancient and dangerous. It must be dealt with by someone who understands its origins." With the priest's guidance, Lior and Mark began the search for a place where they could safely store the talisman, a sanctuary that would keep its darkness contained. They traveled to distant lands, consulted with scholars and mystics, and faced challenges that tested their courage and their love for each other. Yet, through it all, the whispers remained, a constant companion reminding them of the burden they bore. Their quest led them to an isolated monastery high in the mountains, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. The monks there took one look at the silver box and knew the gravity of the situation. They agreed to take the talisman, to guard it with their lives and their faith. Lior and Mark felt a weight lifted from their shoulders as they handed it over, the whispers fading away. But as they stood on the balcony of the monastery, watching the sun set over the breathtaking view, Lior turned to Mark. "We've done our part," she said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "But what if there are others like us, others who need to hear the whispers?" Mark took her hand, understanding in his eyes. "We can't ignore them," he said. "We've been chosen for this path, to help those who can't help themselves." And so, with a newfound purpose, Lior and Mark left the safety of the monastery, the whispers of apartment 7, still echoing in their hearts. They knew that their journey was far from over, that the whispers of the lost and the damned would always find them, but they were ready to face whatever came next, together, as the guardians of the unseen world. Upon their return, the apartment complex had an air of calm that was almost eerie. The other residents had noticed a change, a lifting of the oppressive atmosphere that had once suffocated the very walls. Lior and Mark were met with whispers of gratitude, tales of restful nights and peaceful days. But they knew that the whispers of the past could never truly be silenced, only contained. They decided to use their experiences to help others, sharing their knowledge and skills to guide those caught in the web of the supernatural. They set up a discreet consultation service, their apartment a beacon for those in need. Lior's empathy grew stronger, her ability to connect with the spirits more profound, and Mark's writing took a turn toward the non-fictional, documenting their cases in a series of underground books that circulated among those who knew the truth. The whispers grew faint, but they never disappeared. They remained, a gentle reminder of the world that lay just beyond their grasp. Lior would sometimes sit on the balcony, her eyes closed, listening to the faint echoes of the lost souls they had helped. Mark would write late into the night, his words a balm for the tormented spirits that still sought his guidance. They had become the whisperers' confidants, the ones who could speak to the dead and bring them peace. Their life was no longer ordinary, but it was theirs. They had found meaning in the whispers, a way to give back to a world that had given them so much. And as the years passed, their legend grew, a quiet legend of love and sacrifice that was whispered in the shadows of the apartment complex. Lior and Mark had become more than just tenants. They were the guardians of apartment 7A. the ones who had stared into the abyss and not flinched. They had turned their fear into strength, their home into a sanctuary, and their love into a weapon against the dark. One night, as Laura lay in bed, the whispers grew louder once more, a cacophony of voices that seemed to fill the very air. She sat up with a start, her heart racing, and knew that something was wrong. Mark stirred beside her, his eyes snapping open, sensing the change. They had become so attuned to the whispers that they could almost make out words amidst the din. Laura's eyes searched the room, finding nothing but shadows. And then, a single voice emerged from the chaos, clear as a bell. "Thank you," it said, and the whispers fell silent. Laura and Mark looked at each other, understanding in their eyes. They had done more than just survive. They had brought peace to those who had none. The whispers had led them to this place, to this life, and now it was time for them to rest. Their journey was not one of heroism or glory, but of quiet courage and unyielding love. They had faced the darkness and come out the other side, forever changed. The whispers had become a part of them, a reminder of their purpose. And as they lay there in the silence, their hearts beating in unison, they knew that apartment 7, it would never be the same, for they had turned it into a bastion of hope in a world of shadows. The months passed, and their reputation grew. Laura's gift for communication with the spirit world became sought after, and Mark's books provided solace and understanding to those who felt alone in their struggles. They continued to live in the apartment, now a symbol of the light they had brought to the complex. Yet they knew that with great power came great responsibility. The whispers had taught them that there was always more work to be done, more souls to save. One evening, as they were preparing to help a new family move into the apartment, they received a frantic call from an old tenant, Mr. Peterson. His voice trembled as he spoke of strange occurrences in his new home. Laura and Mark exchanged a knowing glance. The whispers had followed them, seeking their aid once more. They packed their tools and headed out into the night, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The house was old and creaky, its walls laden with the weight of untold secrets. As they approached, the whispers grew stronger, a siren song that seemed to beckon them closer. Laura felt a shiver run down her spine, but Mark's hand in hers was warm and reassuring. They stepped inside, and the whispers grew to a roar. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around them. Laura took a deep breath, focusing her energy, and the whispers grew still. Mr. Peterson looked at them with hope in his eyes, and they knew they had to help him. The exorcism was grueling, the malicious presence in the house putting up a fierce fight. But Laura's empathy and Mark's determination proved to be more than it could handle. Together, they sent the spirit into the light, freeing Mr. Peterson from his torment. The house was quiet once more, the shadows no longer dancing menacingly in the corners. As they left, hand in hand, Laura whispered to Mark, "We're going to be okay." The whispers had led them down a path they never could have imagined, but in doing so, they had found their calling. They had become the guardians of the lost, the voice for the voiceless. And as they returned to their own sanctuary, the whispers of apartment 7, it greeted them like old friends, a gentle reminder of the journey they had embarked on together. They knew that the battle was never truly won, that there would always be more shadows to conquer. But with each victory, the whispers grew fainter, the light of their love shining brighter in the dark. And in that light, they found their purpose and the strength to continue their quest. Their apartment had become a beacon in the night, a place where the lost and the troubled could find refuge. Laura had grown into a powerful medium, her ability to communicate with the other side a gift that she used to bring peace to the restless spirits. Mark had honed his skills as an exorcist, his knowledge of the ancient texts and rituals a weapon against the malevolent forces that sought to harm the living. Together, they had become an unstoppable force, feared by the dark and revered by the light. The whispers of apartment 7A had led them to this life, and now they whispered of new beginnings, Laura felt a stirring within her, a new presence that was not of the spirit realm, but of the flesh. She looked at Mark, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and whispered the words that would change their lives forever. "I'm pregnant," she said, and Mark's heart swelled with joy and fear. They had fought so hard to keep their home safe, but now they had to think about the life they were bringing into this world. The baby grew within Laura, a silent presence that filled their lives with wonder and anticipation. They prepared the nursery with care, filling it with the same warmth and light that had driven the shadows from their home. The whispers grew quieter, as if in deference to the new life that was to come. But Mark knew that with the innocence of their child, the stakes had been raised. They had to ensure that apartment 7A remained a sanctuary, not just for themselves, but for their child as well. The day arrived, and with it the whispers grew louder once more, as if heralding the arrival of their baby girl. They named her Hope, a name that echoed through the halls of the apartment complex like a promise of better days. As they cradled her in their arms, the whispers grew still, the shadows retreating before the love that filled the room. Laura looked into Mark's eyes, and they both knew that their fight was not over, but that they had been given the greatest weapon of all, a new life to protect and cherish. The whispers of apartment 7A had led them to each other, had given them purpose, and now they had given them a child. As they watched Hope sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of innocence, they knew that their battles would never truly end. But they also knew that as long as they had each other, and as long as they had hope, they could face whatever the whispers threw at them. They had become the guardians of the light, and together they would ensure that the shadows never claimed their home or their hearts ever again. Days turned to months, and Hope grew into a curious toddler, her laughter a balm for the weary spirits that still roamed the halls. Laura and Mark continued their work, their reputation spreading like wildfire among those who knew the truth. They helped those in need, their apartment a bastion of peace in a world of whispers. Yet the whispers grew restless, yearning for the day when they would be silenced for good. One evening, as Hope played with her toys in the living room, the whispers grew so loud that the walls seemed to tremble. Laura and Mark knew that something was wrong, something more powerful than they had ever encountered before. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mix of dread and determination. They had to find the source of this new disturbance before it could harm their child. They followed the whispers into the stairwell, the cold seeping into their very bones. The door to apartment 7 loomed before them, the number taunting them with its silent malevolence. Laura took a deep breath, her hand tightening around Mark's as they stepped into the darkness. The whispers grew into a cacophony of screams and wails, the air thick with anger and despair. But amidst the chaos, they heard a single voice, clear and calm. It was the voice of the girl who had haunted them so long ago, now a beacon of peace in the storm. They pushed open the door to find the apartment transformed. Gone were the shadows and the cold, replaced by a warm, welcoming light. The girl stood in the center of the room, her eyes filled with a serene wisdom that belied her age. "You've done well," she said, her voice the same melodious lullaby that had guided them to the talisman. "But now, there is one more thing you must do." The girl explained that the whispers had grown restless because they had been forgotten. The souls trapped in the apartment complex yearned for peace, for the chance to move on. Laura and Mark had to find a way to lay them to rest, to give them the closure they so desperately needed. It was a task that would test their limits, but they knew they had to do it. For the sake of their daughter, for the sake of their home. They had to silence the whispers once and for all. The following days were a blur of research and preparation. They sought out ancient texts, spoke to the priest who had first introduced them to the world of exorcisms, and gathered their most powerful artifacts. Laura's empathy grew stronger, allowing her to feel the pain of the trapped spirits more acutely, while Mark's knowledge of the supernatural grew deeper, his mind a fortress against the whispers' seductive call. On the night of the final ritual, they stood in the girl's room, their hearts pounding in their chests. Laura held the silver box, her eyes closed, her thoughts focused on the souls within. Mark recited the incantation, his voice a beacon of light in the dark. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but Laura's love for her daughter, for Mark, for the lost souls, was a barricade they could not breach. As the final words of the incantation left his lips, the box grew hot in Laura's hands. The whispers reached a crescendo, and then, with a sound like shattering glass, they were gone. The room was quiet, the light dimming until only the soft glow of the moon remained. The girl appeared before them, a smile on her face. "Thank you," she said, her eyes now filled with a gentle light. "You've set us free." With those words, she faded away, leaving Laura and Mark alone in the room. They looked at each other, the weight of their responsibility lifted. They had done it. They had silenced the whispers of apartment 7A, but as they stepped out into the hallway, hand in hand, they knew that their work was not over. There would always be whispers in the dark, always souls in need of their help. And together, with the love of their daughter guiding them, they would continue to be the guardians of the light, the voice for the voiceless, the hope in the shadows. The whispers grew faint, the hallways of the apartment complex once again filled with the mundane sounds of everyday life. Laura and Mark walked back to their apartment, their hearts filled with a newfound sense of peace. They knew that they had changed the very fabric of their reality, that their battles had made a difference. The whispers had led them to this place, had shaped them into the people they were today. And now, with hope by their side, they had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. They entered their apartment, the warm glow of the candles a comforting embrace. Hope looked up at them, her eyes wide with curiosity. Laura picked her up, her heart swelling with love as she whispered, "Mommy and Daddy are home, sweetie." Mark closed the door behind them, the final barrier between their sanctuary and the whispers outside. They had conquered their fears, turned their home into a bastion of peace. But they also knew that the whispers would never truly die, that there would always be more battles to fight. The whispers of apartment 7A had become a part of their lives, a reminder of the world they had been chosen to protect. And as they sat down to dinner, their child's laughter filling the air, they whispered their own incantation of love and protection. For they had become more than just a family. They were the guardians of the unseen world. The whispers of the lost and the damned would always find them, but now they had the power to silence them, to bring peace to those in pain. And as they closed their eyes and whispered their prayers, the shadows retreated, and the light grew stronger. For Laura, Mark, and little Hope, the whispers had led them to their destiny, and together they would face whatever the night had in store. The days grew brighter, the whispers fewer and farther between. Laura's empathy grew into a powerful tool, allowing her to help others find their way. Mark's writing became a testament to their battles, a guide for those who walked the same path. They had become a beacon in the darkness, a symbol of hope for those who had none. And as they watched Hope grow, her curiosity and kindness a mirror of their own, they knew that the whispers had not just changed their lives, but had given them a legacy to pass on. But the whispers never truly disappeared. They remained, a constant reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Laura and Mark knew that their journey was far from over, that there would always be spirits in need of their help. They continued to receive calls, to be drawn into battles against the forces of darkness. Yet with each victory, they felt their bond growing stronger, their hearts beating in unison with the whispers of the souls they had saved. One fateful night, as they were preparing for bed, the whispers grew louder than ever before. Laura and Mark exchanged a look, their hearts racing with a mix of fear and resolve. They knew that this was not just another spirit seeking their aid, but something much more powerful, something that threatened not just their home, but the very fabric of their existence. They took Hope into their arms and whispered their final incantation, a promise to each other and to the world beyond that they would fight until the end. The walls of the apartment trembled, the whispers growing into a deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything was silent. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, the taste of otherworldly energy on their tongues. They had done it. They had faced the ultimate challenge and emerged victorious. Laura looked at Mark, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. "We'll always be the guardians," she said, her voice strong and clear. "As long as there are whispers, we'll be here." And with that, they closed the door to apartment 7A, the whispers of the past becoming a gentle lullaby that cradled their future in a blanket of peace. Their lives took on a new rhythm, one that was punctuated by the occasional disturbance in the fabric of reality. Laura's work grew in demand, her reputation as a medium spreading beyond the confines of their small community. Mark's books became bestsellers, his words offering solace and guidance to those who felt lost. They balanced their roles as parents to Hope with their calling to help the spirits who were trapped in the liminal spaces. They taught her about empathy and courage, about the power of love, and the importance of standing up to the shadows. But the whispers had left their mark, a constant reminder of the battles they had fought. Laura often found herself waking in the night, her heart racing, the echoes of past exorcisms lingering in her mind. And Mark, his writing now a catharsis for the darkness he had faced, poured his soul into his work, his words a shield against the whispers that still haunted him. They had become the guardians of the lost, their hearts forever entwined with the spirits they had encountered. As Hope grew, she began to exhibit a gift of her own, a spark of the supernatural that Laura and Mark had both hoped and feared she would inherit. Her laughter could dispel the darkest of shadows, her touch soothing even the most restless of spirits. They knew that she was special, that she would play a pivotal role in the ongoing battle against the whispers. They trained her, taught her how to control and harness her powers, and as she grew, so too did their resolve to keep her safe. The whispers of apartment 7A had led them to this point, had shaped them into the family they were today. They had become the protectors of the unseen world, the light that pierced the veil of darkness. And as they sat in their living room, the warm glow of the candles reflecting in their eyes, they knew that the whispers had chosen them for a reason. They were the guardians of hope, the keepers of peace in a world that was so often filled with fear. And together, they would continue to fight, to love, and to whisper their own incantations of light into the night. As Hope grew, she became more and more aware of the whispers that surrounded her. Laura and Mark were cautious, not wanting to overwhelm her with the weight of their calling. Yet she embraced it with an innocence that was both heartwarming and terrifying. She spoke to the spirits as if they were old friends, her laughter a balm to their tortured souls. The whispers grew quieter in her presence, as if even they knew that she was destined for greatness. The day came when Hope was old enough to understand the full extent of their mission. Laura and Mark sat her down, their hearts heavy with the burden they were about to share. They told her about the whispers, about the lost souls that needed their help. And as they spoke, she looked at them with wide eyes, filled with a wisdom that was beyond her years. "I know," she said, her voice small but strong, "and I want to help." Together, they formed an unbreakable trio, their love and determination a force that the whispers could not withstand. They faced each new challenge with courage and compassion, their hearts beating as one. Laura's empathy grew stronger, her ability to commune with the spirits a gift that was both awe-inspiring and exhausting. Mark's knowledge of the ancient texts grew deeper, his mind a fortress against the whispers' seductive call. And Hope, their beacon of light, grew into a young woman who could soothe even the most troubled of spirits with a single touch. The whispers of apartment 7A had led them down a path they never could have imagined, had tested their limits and their love. But in the end, they had triumphed, turning their home into a bastion of peace in the heart of the city. They had become a family bound not just by blood, but by a shared destiny, a legacy of hope. And as they stood together, their hearts whispering the incantations that had become second nature, they knew that no matter what the night had in store, they would face it as one. The whispers grew fainter, the battles less frequent, but Laura, Mark, and Hope remained vigilant. They knew that the darkness was never truly defeated, that it merely slumbered, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. But they also knew that they had the power to keep it at bay, to be the light that guided others through the shadows. And as they looked out over the city, their apartment a bastion of peace in the sea of chaos, they whispered a final incantation of love and protection. For they were the guardians of apartment 7A, and they would stand firm against whatever the whispers threw at them. Their lives had been forever changed by the whispers, but in the end, they had found their purpose. They had become more than just a family. They were the beacon of hope for those who had none. And as they watched over the souls that still wandered the halls, they knew that their work was never truly done. But with each victory, with each soul laid to rest, the whispers grew quieter and the light grew stronger. The whispers of apartment 7A had led them to each other, had shaped them into the heroes they were meant to be. And as they stood, hand in hand, their hearts filled with love and determination, they whispered their promise to the night. We will always be here. For in the quiet moments between the battles, in the gentle hum of their everyday lives, they had found their true calling, to be the guardians of the lost, the voice for the voiceless, the light in the darkness. And together, they would face whatever the whispers had in store, their hearts forever entwined with the souls they had vowed to protect. Their days were now a mix of the ordinary and the extraordinary, with moments of quiet joy and moments of heart-pounding fear. Laura had become a renowned medium, her gift for connecting with the spirit world, a beacon that drew those in need from far and wide. Mark's writing had taken on a new depth, his stories resonating with those who had faced the whispers themselves. And Hope, their shining star, had grown into a young woman who could command the spirits with a look, her empathy a weapon that could cut through even the thickest of shadows. As the years passed, the whispers grew less frequent, but the legacy of apartment 7A remained. Laura, Mark, and Hope had become a symbol of hope for the city, a reminder that in the darkest of places, there was always a glimmer of light. They had turned their home into a sanctuary, a place where lost souls could find peace and the living could find solace. The whispers had become a part of them, a constant reminder of the battles they had won and the souls they had set free. Yet there were moments when the whispers grew restless, hinting at a darkness that had not yet been vanquished. Laura and Mark would look at each other, their eyes filled with a silent understanding, knowing that their work was never truly finished. They had become the whisper hunters, the guardians of the city's forgotten corners. And as they held each other close, their hearts whispering incantations of love and protection, they knew that together they could face whatever the night had in store. For they had found their purpose in the whispers of apartment 7A, and it was a legacy they would pass down to Hope, ensuring that the light would always burn bright in the face of the shadows. One evening, as Hope approached her 20s, she stumbled upon a spirit unlike any they had encountered before. It was a creature of pure malice, a whisper that seemed to feed on fear itself. Laura and Mark felt the coldness of its presence, the air in the apartment thick with malevolence. They knew that this was no ordinary soul in need of guidance, but something ancient and powerful that had been awakened by their very existence. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the apartment trembled with the force of their fury. They gathered their most potent artifacts and sacred texts, preparing for the most dangerous ritual they had ever performed. Their friends and allies, those who had stood by them through the years of whispers and battles, came to offer their support. They stood in a circle in the living room, their voices raised in unison, their hearts beating as one. The whispers grew louder, the room colder, and the very air seemed to crackle with the energy of the unseen world. Hope, now a force to be reckoned with in her own right, stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a light that was both terrifying and beautiful. The battle was fierce, the whispers of the malevolent spirit clawing at their minds, attempting to shatter their resolve. Laura and Mark fought alongside Hope, their love for each other and their commitment to their mission, a shield against the darkness. The air was thick with incantations and the smell of burning herbs, the candles flickering as the shadows danced around them. And then, as if a dam had broken, the whispers stopped. The room was still, the silence so profound it was deafening. Laura looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with pride and a touch of fear. "What have we unleashed?" she thought, as the realization of their newfound power began to dawn. But there was no time for contemplation, for the whispers had only been silenced, not banished. The creature had retreated, biding its time, waiting for their guard to drop. They knew that they had to be ready, to train harder, to learn more, to become more than just guardians. They had to become the whispers themselves, to navigate the shadowy realms and bring peace to the lost souls that dwelt there. Laura, Mark, and Hope stood together, their eyes gleaming with a newfound purpose. The whispers of Apartment 7A had led them to this moment, had forged them into something greater than they had ever imagined. Their lives had been irrevocably changed by the whispers, but they had emerged stronger, more connected than ever before. They had become the silent sentinels of the city, their hearts whispering the incantations that kept the darkness at bay. And as they stood in their living room, the ghosts of their past battles surrounding them, they made a pact to never stop fighting. For as long as there were whispers, they would be there, their love and light a beacon in the shadows, ready to face whatever the night had in store. The creature's retreat had left an eerie calm in Apartment 7A, one that Laura, Mark, and Hope knew was only temporary. They spent the following weeks preparing, researching, and training. They sought out the most ancient texts, the ones that spoke of whispers that could shake the very foundations of the world. They studied under the most revered mediums, learning to harness their own whispers into a weapon of hope. And as they worked, the whispers grew more insistent, a reminder that the battle was far from over. The whispers grew more intense, weaving a tapestry of fear that threatened to overwhelm them. But Laura and Mark had become adept at navigating the supernatural realm, their bond with Hope a bulwark against the darkness. They delved deeper into the forgotten annals of the building's history, uncovering secrets that had been buried for centuries. They discovered that the creature they had faced was but one of many, each a manifestation of the grief and anger that had been trapped within the walls of Apartment 7A. The night of the final battle approached, the whispers crescendoing into a symphony of dread. Laura, Mark, and Hope stood in the heart of their apartment, their eyes closed, their voices raised in a chant that resonated through the very fabric of reality. The air grew thick with the scent of incense and the sound of ancient prayers. And as the whispers reached their peak, the apartment was filled with a blinding light, and the spirits they had helped over the years appeared around them, their faces a tapestry of gratitude and determination. The creature of darkness materialized before them, a twisted amalgamation of fear and despair. Laura, Mark, and Hope stepped forward, their eyes shining with the light of 1,000 souls. The whispers grew silent as the battle began, their hearts beating in unison, their voices a harmony of power and love. The creature roared, its malicious whispers echoing through the room, but they remained steadfast, their incantations a shield that grew stronger with every beat of their hearts. The confrontation was fiercer than any they had faced before, the whispers of the creature a cacophony of pain that threatened to consume them. Yet they stood firm, their eyes never leaving the monstrous form that loomed before them. And as they chanted, their voices grew louder, the whispers of the lost souls joining them in a chorus of redemption. The creature wailed in fury, its form beginning to disintegrate. And then, with a final desperate scream, the creature was gone, its whispers silenced. The apartment was bathed in a soft, golden light, the shadows retreating into the corners where they belonged. Laura, Mark, and Hope looked at each other, their eyes filled with relief and a newfound strength. They had done it. They had conquered the whispers that had haunted them for so long. The whispers of Apartment 7A had led them on a journey that had tested their limits and their love. They had become more than just a family. They were the guardians of the city's soul. the voices that whispered peace into the hearts of the lost. And as they embraced, the whispers grew faint, their work a testament to the power of hope in the face of the darkest of fears. They had become the whispers themselves, their hearts forever bound to the apartment that had been their prison and their salvation. Their lives would never be the same. The whispers of Apartment 7A, a constant reminder of the battles they had fought. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the candles flickered and the night was still, they knew that they had found their purpose. They were the guardians, the whisper hunters, the keepers of peace in a world that was often shrouded in shadow. And as they stood together, their hearts whispering the incantations of love and protection, they knew that the whispers had led them to their true destiny. The whispers had become a part of them, a legacy that they would pass on to Hope. Laura and Mark watched as she grew into a woman of power and compassion, her empathy a gift that could conquer even the most malevolent of spirits. They knew that one day she would carry on their work, her heart a beacon in the darkness. The whispers grew fainter, the battles less frequent. But the promise they had made to each other remained. They had become an unshakable force, their love and dedication to each other, and their mission unbreakable. Laura and Mark watched with pride as Hope continued to develop her gift, her empathy extending to not just the lost souls of Apartment 7A, but to the living as well. She had become a beacon of comfort to those who were haunted by their own personal demons, her presence a gentle whisper of reassurance. The city grew to know them, not just as the couple who had survived the whispers, but as the guardians of hope. Laura had become a renowned medium, her abilities sought after by those desperate for a connection with their loved ones. Mark's writing had evolved, his words now a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the battles they had faced. And Hope, their shining star, was the bridge between the living and the dead, her kindness a balm to even the most tortured of souls. Yet the whispers never fully disappeared. They remained a constant presence, a reminder of the shadowy realm that existed alongside their world. Laura and Mark knew that their work was never truly done, that there would always be more souls in need of their help. And so, they continued to refine their skills, to learn from the whispers that lingered, to prepare for whatever lay ahead. They had become the whispers, a living, breathing embodiment of the promise they had made to each other and to those they had vowed to protect. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of their apartment, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Laura looked at Mark, her eyes filled with a mix of anticipation and dread. "It's time," she said, her voice low. "The whispers are leading us to the next battle." Mark nodded, his gaze never leaving hers, understanding the gravity of her words. For they knew that the darkness had not disappeared. It had merely been waiting, biding its time. The trio stood as one, their hearts whispering the incantations that had become a part of their very being. They approached the balcony, the whispers growing stronger as they stepped closer to the edge. Laura reached out, her hand touching the cold railing, and the whispers grew louder, a symphony of lost souls crying out for help. Mark and Hope flanked her, their love a wall against the shadows that sought to claim them. They knew that whatever awaited them, they would face it together. The whispers grew into a crescendo, the very air around them vibrating with the power of the unseen world. Laura's eyes snapped open, and she looked out into the night, her gaze piercing the veil that separated the living from the dead. The whispers grew clearer, pointing to a place far beyond the confines of their apartment complex. A place where the whispers of the lost were silenced by a much darker force. They had conquered Apartment 7A, but the whispers had led them to a new battlefield. Laura, Mark, and Hope knew that their journey was just beginning, that the whispers had chosen them to be the guardians of not just one haunted place, but of all the lost souls that roamed the city's streets. They took a deep breath, their hearts whispering in unison, and stepped off the balcony into the night, ready to face whatever darkness awaited them. Their eyes searched the shadows, their ears tuned to the faintest of whispers. The city was vast, a labyrinth of pain and despair that called to them. Yet, they had faced the abyss before and emerged stronger. The whispers grew clearer, guiding them to a dilapidated building, its windows boarded up, its walls marred by the ravages of time. It was here that they would find the next soul in need of their help, the next whisper to be set free. The door creaked open, the darkness within beckoning them forth. Laura stepped into the threshold, her eyes glowing with the light of the spirits that had come before them. Mark followed closely, his hand tight around the sacred text that had become his shield. And Hope, their beacon, brought up the rear, her empathy reaching out to the lost soul that awaited them. The whispers grew louder, the shadows thicker, but they pressed on, their hearts whispering the incantations of hope and peace. They moved through the building, each room a chapter in the story of sorrow and anger that had been trapped within. As they reached the heart of the structure, the whispers grew to a deafening crescendo. Laura, Mark, and Hope could feel the very fabric of reality stretching around them, the darkness trying to consume the light they brought. Laura raised her hands, her eyes shining with an inner power that seemed to illuminate the room. The whispers grew silent, the shadows retreating before her. In the center of the room, they found the source of the malevolence, a creature of pure despair that had fed on the pain of the lost souls for centuries. Its eyes were pools of darkness, its whispers a siren's call to those who dared enter. Yet, Laura's voice was stronger, her words a lullaby that soothed the creature's rage. The creature began to dissipate, its form unraveling before their eyes. The whispers grew faint, the shadows retreating. As the last of the darkness faded, a gentle light filled the room. The whispers of Apartment 7A had led them to this moment, the culmination of their journey. They had become the silent guardians of the city's soul, the whispers that offered peace to the lost. They stood there, the echoes of their past battles a testament to their strength. Laura turned to Mark, her eyes filled with love and relief. "It's over," she murmured, her voice barely audible in the newfound silence. Mark nodded, his grip on her hand tightening. "For now," he said, a hint of the ever-present vigilance in his voice. The whispers had led them to victory, but they knew that the battle was never truly won. There would always be more souls to save, more whispers to guide them through the night. But they had found their purpose, their hearts forever bound to the apartment that had been their prison and their salvation. Together, Laura, Mark, and Hope stepped out into the night, their eyes searching the horizon for the next call of the lost. They were the guardians, the whisper hunters, the light in the shadowy world of the unseen. And as they moved through the city, their hearts whispered the incantations that had become their anthem, their legacy. The whispers grew faint, the battles less frequent, but the promise they had made to each other remained. They had become the whispers of hope, their love and dedication to their mission unshakable. Laura and Mark watched with pride as Hope grew into a woman of immense power and empathy, her gift a beacon that could conquer any darkness. The city whispered their story, the legend of the family that had conquered the malevolence of Apartment 7A. Laura and Mark knew that their work was never done, that the whispers of the lost would always call to them. Yet they faced each new challenge with the strength of those who had come before, their hearts whispering the incantations of love and protection. In the quiet moments, when the candles flickered and the night was still, they knew that the whispers had led them to their true destiny. They were the guardians of hope, the keepers of peace in a world shrouded in shadow. And as they stood together, their hearts whispering in unison, they knew that their legacy would live on, their light a constant in the ever-shifting tapestry of the city's soul. The whispers had led them to victory, had forged them into heroes they never knew they could be. And as they stepped into the night, the whispers of Apartment 7A trailing behind them, they knew that their story was far from over. For in the world of the unseen, the whispers never truly die. They only wait for the next guardians to hear their call.